right. Today, we're very fortunate to have with us Congressman Kelly Armstrong from North Dakota. Um, Congressman, by way of introduction, I see you're from Dickinson, North Dakota. You've spent your entire life in North Dakota. You understand business. You understand government policy. You're with a state that you were first elected to Congress in 2018, but a state that has abundant supplies of natural resources, not just energy, but on the agriculture front. And so it's a true honor to have you with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. This should be fun.
Absolutely. And my name is Brigham McCown. I am the Senior Fellow and Director of Hudson Institute's Initiative on American Energy Security. Congressman is in Washington, D.C. I am in Berlin, Germany, where I'm attending an innovation seminar, global seminar on pipeline infrastructure and innovation. Congressman, you are also, by way of introduction, the Vice Chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House. You're on several subcommittees, including those relating to the regulation of telecom, innovation, food, drug safety, and energy. That makes you a very busy and popular man.
I don't know about popular, but busy for sure.
Yes, sir. So getting, right into it, and I really appreciate, again, you joining us. One of the initiatives here at Hudson is to try to come up with a coherent energy security strategy that takes a look at domestic energy policy and how that policy is very important to our national security, our economic security as well. From your perspective, starting off here, framing the issue of American energy security, for you, how would you define and what do you think are the important aspects of an energy security policy?
Well, first of all, I think you start with one, and North Dakota is a big reason of this. We're one of the only countries in the world that's both food and energy secure. As we continue to move into the 21st century, that is a tremendous strategic advantage on the global stage. And only in a place as crazy as Washington, D.C., would we try to make that strategic advantage a disadvantage. And it's all of the above, right? It really is. I grew up in the oil business. My dad started in the oil business since before I was born. I grew up politically in the oil business. I got elected to the state Senate in 2012. North Dakota was in the middle of an oil boom. I sponsored the largest infrastructure bill in history. We rewrote all our pipeline bills in North Dakota. Turns out the regulation has to be a little different when you're laying 100 miles of pipe a week versus 100 miles of pipe a year. And we continue to do these things in DC, and we want to move forward. And I think the biggest difference I've noticed in DC, particularly on energy and commerce, is Republicans are kind of agnostic towards infrastructure and R&D. We want it for everything. It doesn't matter if it's a pipeline. Doesn't matter if it's a highway, doesn't matter if it's a rail line, doesn't matter if it's a transmission line. We used to be really good at getting this stuff into the ground and being able to do it. And we're not anymore. And it's through litigation, bureaucratic morass, 1,000 different reasons. And unfortunately, right now, when we talk about energy transition, which I hope we can get to in a little bit, there's too many people out here that pick winners and losers.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about critical infrastructure for a minute. Well, actually, let me back up just a second. So every president since the Arab oil embargo of 72, 73 has talked about energy independence. And, for many years, people sort of laughed. It was a throwaway point for a politician running for president to say, we're going to become energy secure. But we became energy independent, didn't we?
And for anybody who's watching this from Texas, you might have invented horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing down there, but we really perfected it in Western North Dakota. And by the way, it's also great for climate. It's since 2017, the U.S. is the only country in the world, essentially, that lowered its climate emissions. That's because of the Bakken in North Dakota. It was the only mature play at the time. We discovered this incredible resource of oil, but also this incredible resource of natural gas. And so you can do both things at once. We just have to get policy based on the reality of what it's going to take to drive the world and drive the U.S. economy over the next 50 years and not have ideological environmental policy that's really based on outsourcing our guilt.
Yeah, so when we talk about energy security, I like to talk about it has to be available, secure, affordable, abundant. Would you add anything else to that definition, or does that pretty much hit it?
Exportable. I think we've
Okay.
noticed this right now with the war in the Ukraine, and a lot of our European ally friends would love a whole bunch of our liquefied natural gas and to be less reliant. And the infrastructure for that takes time. I think it has to be exportable too. We know this because we produce really great light crude in the Bakken, but we need heavy crude in the Gulf, and we get a lot of it from our nearest neighbor and ally, which is Canada.
Okay, and just framing that up a little bit. So refineries are set up for certain types of crude oil, and traditionally a lot of the Gulf Coast refineries are set up for heavier crude oil versus the lighter, sweeter crude that comes from North Dakota. Do I have that right?
Yeah, we're about 98% diesel, and we're really proud of it, and it's great for a lot of things. But if you're making marine fuel in the Gulf, you want heavy crude, not light crude.
Yeah. So with respect to exportability, then you're suggesting that energy is an important component of our foreign policy strategy, helping our friends and allies as well.
Absolutely. And particularly when you consider who controls the vast amount of the energy supply in the Middle East and in Russia and all of those and all of the places, which by any stretch, we've seen the things that have been going on in Saudi Arabia and Iran and all of those different issues. When the US can provide our allies with something that they need to run their economies as well, there's two things that happen. One, no matter what dispute we're in with Germany, we're not rolling tanks into Berlin. And two, we do it cleaner than anybody else. And I think a lot of the rhetoric and narrative around climate over the last 15 years has negated that simple scientific fact.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier that we had a strength, energy independence, which includes helping our allies. And at least this administration, if not previous administrations, have undermined that at every turn, have thrown that away, have given it away. Why is that?
Well, I think for a lot of reasons. And one, you can go all the way back to when I was in the 7th grade and the Berlin Wall fell, right? For many, many decades, we're the only superpower. And there is this entire, there is an entire cottage industry out of shutting down the fossil fuel industry. And you don't have to, it's happened elsewhere, right? Germany is very, very lucky they had an unseasonably warm winter this year. And I think the problem is the long-term energy policies for all of these places look a lot different than the short-term politics. But they have started to recognize that relying on one particular country, particularly a country that isn't necessarily in the same ideological place as the rest of Europe for your energy, is horribly, horribly problematic. At the same time, they're shutting down nuclear plants because they've been taken offline 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 7 years ago, and it's really impossible to turn that train around. But they also have other places in which they have real access to natural gas, and to be able to do these things, they just have to develop the infrastructure.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because one of the CEOs of a German natural gas utility company said, we were caught flat-footed. We didn't realize that energy security mattered any longer.
Yeah.
What would you say in response? Yeah.
Well, I would say that you need reliable, resilient, affordable baseload power. And for all of the wind projects and the solar projects and the other weather-dependent projects that exist across the world, they don't keep up with the increase in baseload. Like they don't replace existing baseload. They don't keep up with the increase. So how are we going to do this in a meaningful way? And we can, and then we also have other issues. We have Guyana in the United States, or in the Americas. We have Venezuela, who has a whole different problem. We have real access to a lot of these different things. And instead, I just use Guyana as an example because it's Western Hemisphere. This is Monroe Doctrine stuff. They won't get it. We can't get the XM Bank to lift their $100 million cap without an ESG score. Well, you know who doesn't want an ESG score? China. But Guyana doesn't need a trade agreement. They have oil. They're going to have natural gas. What they need is financing. And it's just outside of any other reason, just strategically look where they're located on a map. That should be something that's important to the United States. And we don't get out of our own way on some of these policy conversations near enough.
Well, and speaking of our own back door, China has obviously made a charm offensive in Central and South America. They've been doing so in Africa for a while. Have we ignored our own backyard, whether it's with energy or mutual assistance?
Well, and I think absolutely, and we just had a hearing today in oversight on ESG, and I think regardless, I mean, American companies have duties to their shareholders. They have duties to all of that. We have the most sophisticated form of benevolent democracy that has ever existed. China's going to burn more, or Northern Africa is going to burn more coal 10 years from now than they burn now. That they're going to. And I don't know why we would take ourselves out of participation in that process. Again, we know how to do it cleaner. We know how to do it better than anyone else. But more importantly, we are seeding real strategic places in the world and the developing nations for a climate ideology that allows somebody to come in and take over where we just fail to act. And that's neither responsible nor is it very smart smart for a foreign policy or a domestic energy and overall national security interest.
So you just mentioned Africa. Part of this conference was a group of African nations talking about building out natural gas infrastructure pipelines throughout northern Africa down to the West Africa. They're investing in more fossil fuels, more pipelines. And when you ask them, well, aren't you decarbonizing? They sort of laugh and say, look, this doesn't work because until you can help us find something that is affordable, that is the same cost of natural gas, and it's just not physically possible to replace tried and true energy sources. They say an energy mix is okay, and sure, we'll have solar in the Sahara and some other pieces, but the single pointed focus of removing all renewables is not reasonable nor rational. I presume you would agree.
Well, and also from a domestic standpoint, when you're trying to lift an entire country out of poverty, two things that have lifted the most people out of poverty in the history of the world are democracies and cheap, reliable energy. And the other parts of that is reliable. You have to have it. They're not interested in some 30-year climate emission goal. They're interested in getting, they don't have running water in a lot of places. They don't have these things. I mean, to try and ask them to incorporate a urban United States version of some kind of climate ideology is just patently, it's not going to happen, and we shouldn't try and do it. What we should do is we should have American companies and American investors deploying the technology that we've developed in places like the Bakken, in the places like the Permian, in places like the Eagle Ford, and we should be deploying those assets and that technology and that know-how over there.
And speaking of hearings, just recently, FERC commissioners, both Republican and Democrat commissioners, appeared before a Senate committee and expressed some real reservations about our ability to make and meet baseload power in the United States with retiring existing production facilities. What should we be doing to add to baseload instead of subtracting from it today?
Well, and I think, you can look at this through the policy framework, the regulatory framework, and the legal framework. West Virginia EPA was a great case. It pulled back. Basically, the Supreme Court said Congress needs to do its job. The agencies can't do the job. The problem is any utility that has been operating under West Virginia, under the EPA's regs, doesn't. It's an 8-year case. We can't rely on the courts to decide these things 8 years later because the regulated universe is going to follow the original rule, not wait and see what happens at the U.S. Supreme Court. One real good thing would be stop passing executive orders that are going to shut down reliable baseload fuel. And whether it ever, I think it's important to remember the Clean Power Plan, the vast majority of it was never enacted, right? They could never get the votes in Congress. It still did a really good job of shutting down coal-fired power plants across the entire United States. And this is before you get into our transmission infrastructure. And this is where I think Democrats and Republicans actually have an ability to come together. By any one of the clean power utopian plans being posed by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, you need 2.5 times the infrastructure we have right now. You want to make 2/3 of all the cars in the United States electric by 2032? Where are you going to plug them in? And don't take my word for it. The New York Times wrote an article 2 months about it. We don't have the infrastructure to do this. And we are, the Texas event, and with the Texas event, Texas has some unique grid issues. But there was also a cold snap all the way up to North Dakota. The entire country was through one, and we were very close on the MISO grid to having significant brownouts. Mm-hmm. And any loss of life is unbelievably terrible and terrifying. But I can just tell you, if we lose power for the same amount of time Houston did in North Dakota in January, we have a whole different set of real human consequences.
Right. So why are we weakening ourselves? Why is this administration picking winners and losers? Why are we investing in something with no end goal, no knowledge of how much it's going to cost or if it's even going to work?
It's really hard. And I think some of this, and Republicans were late to the game on the climate fight, right? The minute climate change pulled equal with global warming, the fight was over. I mean, the political fight. I used to pick juries for a living. And so we were late to the game on this fight, and we're not very good at telling our story in a great way. The cleanest MCF of gas in the world is in Western North Dakota. But I think the other answer is for far too many people, this is no long. I've had conversations with normal, reasonable, rational people that on any other issue, you can agree, you can disagree, you might come to an agreement, you might not, but you'll have a normal, thoughtful conversation. But when you talk about climate, they'll run out of the room with their hair on fire. And so how do you do this? I think, NEPA reform is part of this conversation. There's a lot of different issues, but we have to figure out a way to get this infrastructure in the ground faster. Otherwise, we're gonna run into a real Texas-sized problem, except sometime it's gonna happen in Chicago or North Dakota or somewhere in January. And then I don't want to wait for everybody to wake up.
Well, you touched on permitting and infrastructure. I had an article just a few days ago in Real Clear Energy talking about the fact that we have to have permitting reform, regardless of what kind of infrastructure you want to put in the ground, that NEPA is broken. And it seems to be an issue that both Democrats and Republicans at least agree to in principle. So why is it so hard to get this done?
Well, I think, we passed HR 1 over. We're in the middle of a debt limit negotiation. Hopefully it's a negotiation going on. And I think the real question will be, I think anything we get back from the Senate on this will include transmission too, which it should. We need more transmission as well. I think the key question there is how do you pay for it? And the pay for has become important, and 32 trillion in debt is a big reason why. But I think if there's one thing we get done in divided government, or have the best chance to get done outside of a farm bill and an NDAA, the bills we usually find a way to get across, I think it's some kind of substantial permitting reform. I really think we have a chance to do it.
Okay. And can we talk about HR 1 for a minute? Because a lot of Americans aren't really that familiar with it. It's a Republican proposal. What all does it do if it were passed by the Senate?
Well, so it was a combination of lots of different bills. A lot of them ran through natural resources. I can talk more specifically about the ones that ran through energy and commerce. One of my bills was in there, which is a cross-border permitting bill. North Dakota borders Canada. We get a lot of economic activity going both ways across the border. This is not a Keystone XL bill. There's only one company in the world that can build Keystone XL. It's TC Energy, and they've scrapped the steel and they've made economic decisions. But there are 7 or 8 other cross-border projects that exist, some of them replacing existing lines, some of them new lines. Well, the only unique thing about the Keystone XL, there was really 2. It was the most vetted pipeline in history, and it's the only pipeline that can be stopped by the stroke of a pen. Well, these are 12 to 15-year infrastructure projects. How are you going to raise capital for these kind of necessary infrastructure projects if you're going to have 2 or possibly 3 presidential elections in the meantime? So it's not even designed to stop the pipeline so much as it's designed to starve off the investment for them. So that's one way we can do this. We actually did some things to kind of loosen up the bottleneck in refining. As somebody who has ethanol, biodiesel, renewable diesel, and a ton of oil and natural gas in North Dakota, nobody's against more blended barrels. What we're against right now is the blended barrels are replacing traditional barrels, because we haven't brought a refinery online in the United States with any true downstream capacity since 1976 in Louisiana. We have to figure out a way to get more refining capacity online, which is also the side note, the bad thing about this new EPA reg the Biden administration is pushing. Whether it ever becomes law or not, the minute it drops, we're going to lose more refining barrels because they're making these economic decisions based on, 7-8 year plans. So we do all of this stuff really well. This bill made it easier to get infrastructure in the ground. By the way, it doesn't take away any single environmental requirement, not a one. It just requires them to get done in a reasonable amount of, actually it's an unreasonable amount of time, but at least it's a finite amount of time. Increase refining capacity and allowed for more. I mean, the energy side of this really truly was a linear infrastructure bill. How can we allow the federal government to allow private enterprise to raise capital and get these needed infrastructure permits into the ground faster? Section 401 is water law. You know, we have waters of the U.S., which would put North Dakota about 92% under federal primacy. And at the same time, we're allowing liberal states to use their interpretation of federal water law to stop states like from North Dakota from getting their product to market. It's basically an inversion of what interstate commerce should be. So we rolled a little bit of that back and gave those things. And there's two sides, right? There's two real sides of this. One, it's actually going to help get infrastructure in the ground. But two, it's going to send a signal to markets and send a signal to companies that we're actually open for business again, which will immediately stimulate capital and stimulate investment.
So talking about government decisions, and one of the things I used to say as the federal regulator at PHMSA is that uncertainty, whether it's of law or regulation, increases risk. Risk is something that businesses and capital markets try to avoid. Do you think this administration is doing what they can to lower risk and set the seeds for investment in infrastructure?
This is the last real spike in oil prices, first time in my lifetime where you see a massive spike in prices doesn't correlate to a massive increase in drilling. First time ever. There's only one reason for it. They don't trust this administration and they don't trust this government to allow them to get the infrastructure. We're geographic center in North America, Rugby, North Dakota. We need to be able to get our product to market. And so now, by the way, none of the big five are in North Dakota. These are small, mid-level independent companies that are looking at it, and they have a duty to their shareholders, and they are looking at this in a completely different way. And that is solely based on government decisions and how they're making it forward, because just drilling the oil well doesn't work. You have to be able to refine the product. You have to be able to move the natural gas. You have to be able to do all of these things. And it's the first time in history that's ever happened. And I don't think it's an accident that it did. We have to send signals that we are interested in doing this. At the same time, we are so derelict in our leasing program in the Gulf that 10 years from now, we're going to have another oil crunch if we're not paying attention.
Okay. Shifting gears back for a second to legislation you've co-sponsored. One has to do with natural gas stoves. Could you tell everybody a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, Liz, there's two things about this that I think, and there's a second part of this which I really care about. And we saw a little of this in California, and we're going to have it. I also deal a lot with the privacy legislation that moves around and all of this. One of the reasons I think everybody wants everything electric is because it's all plugged into the internet. And at the same time, there was everybody saying Republicans are making a huge deal out of gas stoves. New York has now banned them on all new issues, or on all new construction. They've got a model to roll in. By the way, they're also having a revolt internally from their own developers and their own renters and all of those different things. But yeah, we sponsored a bill that says you're not, I mean, there's a lot of these, and some of it was in the IRA and these tax credits and all of these things, which are, it's everything, by the way, from transformers for utility lines to gas stoves. They are trying to federally regulate at a pace which makes everything more expensive for the consumer. And that simply does not make sense. And we have to continue to have a robust portfolio. And I think this is a little bit, also, it's a little interesting because most of that electricity is still created by carbon. They may not want it to be. And when they talk about an energy transition, we've never transitioned from a way of primary energy in this country, in the world, in the history of the world. We burn as much wood as we did 2,000 years ago. When they talk about transition and ending this stuff, that's just simply not going to happen. It never has. So transition should look like a more robust portfolio. But in order to do that, you need the transmission infrastructure. You need to be able to move weather-dependent power further if you want to have reliability and resiliency on the grid. But you also have to be able to have gas-fired power plants, nuclear power plants, coal-fired power plants that are there when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. And so we create these, when you can sell a renewable electron onto the grid for cheaper than it costs to produce, it is pretty difficult for a gas plant to compete with that. When you give wind and solar absolute primacy on the grid, it's pretty hard for a coal-fired power plant to start up and wind down quickly. So we've already created this environment which makes it very, very difficult, and we have to start unwinding some of this.
So isn't this part of what you had alluded to earlier in our conversation, which is the government is intervening in market conditions, picking winners and losers through tax policy, through subsidies and other tax credits and preferences?
Yeah, you have a production tax credit, a repower provision, and primacy on the grid. You've said, I mean, I've said this in hearings before. They want to, there's a lot of talk about how wind and solar is now cheaper to produce than coal. Well, everything's cheaper to produce when you give it a tax break and a subsidy. That's not unique to renewable energy, but the problem is, and you're starting to see this. One, nobody wants them in there. You think it's hard to get a pipeline in Western North Dakota? Try to get a high voltage transmission line through a wealthy suburb in the East Coast, where the minute you stick the shovel in the ground, you devalue every house in that suburb by 40%. Like, we have to figure out a way to do this. And the answer seems to be a lot of times, well, we'll just regulate it and they'll figure it out. Well, that's, in this space, is incredibly dangerous.
Yes, absolutely. Do you think, and I meant to ask you, the natural gas ban on through the building code change that Berkeley tried, that got tossed out by the Ninth Circuit, though, didn't it, stating federal primacy? Will this have an effect outside of the Ninth Circuit? Was this the right ruling? Would it not deter anybody from moving forward at this point?
Well, let's see when a circuit splits, and that could happen pretty quick, right? Just overall, generally, the Ninth Circuit's been a little bit of a pleasant surprise from conservative politics across the last couple of years. But yeah, I mean, I think, and you're going to see more of this, and I think you've seen this court is very willing to push back on administrative agencies. You know, they're taking up the Chevron rule. If you really want to see how they force this to happen, I think this is it. And I also think it has another added benefit. You know, James Madison said Congress would fight to the death to protect its Article 1 authority. That may have been true. I would say currently Congress will fight to the death to maintain their membership in Congress. And so we have abdicated our responsibility to agency regulation over the course of the last 40 years. And I think the Supreme Court's going to force us to do what we were all sent here to do by our voters, which is to take tough votes that matter.
Yeah. And let's talk just for a second about the Chevron doctrine of deference to federal agencies, for anybody who may not be aware of that. So Congress delegates a lot of power to the executive branch, to federal agencies that are, in some cases, quasi-judicial, quasi-legislative, even, and the way what the Supreme Court has taken up are concerns about agencies exceeding their mandates, exceeding their authority, and being properly subjected to oversight by Congress. Is that an accurate representation? It
is an accurate representation. You know, every year somebody in the Republican side of the aisle in the U.S. House of Representatives introduces the REINS Act. The REINS Act is the congressional version of that, where anything over, I think it's $200 million would have to be approved by Congress. But yeah, the Chevron doctrine, I mean, maybe one of the unique benefits of the entire Obamacare fight and U.S. Supreme Court decision was Justice Roberts' ability to look at that, and through the tax policy and how Obamacare went, you know, part of his ruling was at least a signal, at the very least, to reevaluate the Chevron doctrine. And now there's a case that's been granted in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, and that could have a really, really positive impact on anybody who's watching this, where the people you actually elect make the decisions, not the people who work in a cubicle in some nameless, faceless alphabet soup agency. And it's important. And we have to start taking more of that control back.
What can we be doing? What should anybody watching this video from wherever they are in the country, what can they do to try to weigh in?
Well, I think the answer, there's a lot of different answers, but I think one of the things we haven't done as well, and I don't know why, and I think some of it is where it's produced versus where the users use all of this stuff, is be proud of what we do here. We always have to be better at explaining that not only is this a national security issue, it's a jobs issue, and it's an environmental issue. We are really good at producing things the world needs, and we're really good at doing it cleaner and less expensive than anyone else. And the reasons we usually can't is because of government regulation and government interference. And I went through the oil boom in North Dakota, and there were articles from the New York Times about these Superfund sites in Western North Dakota. And I'm like, that's pretty interesting from a group of people who's never been there. You know, everybody who worked in the oil patch in Western North Dakota sent their kids to school there. They hunted and fished there. If you don't like the outdoors, North Dakota is not really the right place for you. And we have to do a better job of telling that story. Go to an offshore rig in the Gulf and then see where all the fish are swimming. They're swimming around the offshore rig. The structure exists. They're clean. We do this better than anyone else, and we have to acknowledge the fact that it doesn't matter where you're at in the world needs this stuff, and if we're not producing it, our strategic adversaries on the world stage are going to be the ones doing it.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. And one of the things that we're researching now is that we talk about America being the arsenal of democracy during 2 world wars, but we were also the arsenal of energy supplies during those 2 world wars. It literally powered the Allied efforts in both world wars. And I'm literally sitting in the former no man's land between East and West Germany right now. This is where this new convention center was built. So with parts of the wall sitting outside. So your thoughts are not lost on me. Anything else you'd like to share in parting comments?
Yeah, I just think I'll continue to sell it the same way I sell North Dakota and DC. I don't try and explain to people out here why what we do in North Dakota is important to us. I try and explain why it's important to them. If you like to fill up your car, you like North Dakota. If you like to buy wheat or bread or corn at the gas or at the grocery store, North Dakota is pretty important to you. If you like to have you turn the light switch and the lights come on, North Dakota is pretty important to you. We have an opportunity to allow U.S. companies and U.S. ingenuity to lead the world into the 21st century energy mix. And we shouldn't shirk ourselves from that responsibility. We should be happy warriors and we should be going full front ahead. I think in a weird place right now because of really strategic things that have happened between Ukraine and Russia, the rest of the world has kind of caught on to natural gas and kind of caught on to what this looks like. We just have to get DC to act a little quicker.
Words to the wise. Thank you, sir, very much for your time today. We really appreciate it. We know how busy you are, and I've personally been to your state several times and can vouch for how beautiful it is.
It's a great place to come in the summer. The winter can get a little tough.
Fair enough. Thank you again for joining us. That's Congressman and Vice Chairman. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you.